The real reason why women come back after rejecting you. Stoicism. There is a story men tell themselves after rejection. It usually involves a plan, a message sent at the right moment, a change of appearance, a clever comeback that will somehow rewrite what already happened. But the men who actually see someone return after walking away are rarely the ones who chased. They are the ones who stopped. This is not a video about tricks or manipulation. It contains no formulas for winning someone back, because that is not what this is about, and if that is what you came here looking for, this will disappoint you. What you will find instead is something more permanent and far more useful. The Stoic understanding of why rejection changes a man, and why the man it changes for the better is the one who becomes worth returning to, whether she ever does or not. This is an important distinction, so let's be clear about it before we go any further. The goal here is not to reverse engineer someone's decision. A person's choice to walk away deserves respect, not a campaign to undo it. What we are exploring instead is why detachment, self-respect, and inner discipline change a man so profoundly that people are naturally drawn back toward him. Not because he pursued them, but because he became someone worth being near. Whether that particular person returns is never guaranteed, and chasing that outcome defeats the entire philosophy we are about to explore. The outcome is not the goal. Becoming a stronger, calmer, more grounded man is the goal, and everything else is simply what tends to follow. The philosophy behind this video stretches back over 2,000 years, to a school of thought built by men who faced exile, loss, illness, and public humiliation, and who developed a system for maintaining inner peace regardless of external circumstance. Rejection is simply one more circumstance among the many life throws at every person eventually. What the Stoics offer is not comfort through denial, but comfort through a clear-eyed understanding of what can actually be controlled and what cannot. Applied to rejection specifically, this framework transforms what feels like a catastrophic ending into simply one data point in a much longer life, one that a disciplined man can respond to with dignity rather than desperation. If you value this kind of grounded thinking, subscribe to Quotes Library. This channel exists to help men build real inner strength through timeless philosophy, not shortcuts. Let's begin. Habit 1. He stopped performing and started living. The most common mistake men make after rejection is escalation. More effort, more attention, more declarations, more proof of worth, as if the right performance will eventually change someone's mind. But performance is exhausting to witness, and most people can sense desperation long before it is spoken aloud. The Stoics understood this dynamic intimately, though they were not writing about romance specifically. Epictetus taught that peace comes only from focusing on what is within your control and releasing your grip on what is not. Another person's feelings, decisions, and timing have never been within anyone's control, no matter how much effort is poured into influencing them. A man who internalizes this stops performing for an audience and starts living according to his own standards. He works out because he values his body, not because he hopes it will be noticed. He builds his career because he respects ambition, not because he wants proof displayed. This shift is subtle but total, from living for reaction to living for alignment with his own values. Ironically, this shift is what people notice most, because performance has an undertone of neediness that authenticity does not carry. There is a story of a Roman senator who, after a public humiliation, withdrew not to plot revenge but to study philosophy in silence for a year. When he returned to public life, colleagues who had once dismissed him found themselves seeking his counsel, not because he had proven anything to them, but because he had visibly become someone whose presence carried weight. He never mentioned the humiliation again. He simply stopped needing anyone's validation to know his own worth, and that quiet certainty became more persuasive than any argument could have been. This shift from performance to alignment rarely happens overnight, and it is worth being honest about how uncomfortable the transition can feel. For weeks, sometimes months, a man caught between these two states will notice the old impulse rising, the urge to post something calculated, to mention an accomplishment within earshot, to engineer a chance encounter. The discipline lies not in never feeling this pull, but in recognizing it for what it is and choosing not to act on it each time a man catches himself mid-performance and redirects toward genuine purpose instead. He strengthens a muscle that eventually makes the old impulse quieter and easier to ignore. This is not a single decision made once. It is a practice, repeated daily, until authenticity becomes the default rather than the exception. Habit 2. He practiced genuine indifference to the outcome. There is a difference between pretending not to care and genuinely releasing attachment to an outcome, and most men never learn to tell them apart. Pretending indifference is still a strategy, a performance aimed at provoking a reaction. Genuine indifference requires no audience at all, because it is not a message being sent to anyone. It is an internal state, cultivated privately, regardless of whether anyone ever witnesses it. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the discipline of desire, the practice of wanting things to happen as they happen, rather than insisting they happen as we wish. This is not resignation or apathy. It is an active, disciplined acceptance that outcomes outside our control do not determine our internal peace. A man who has genuinely internalized this does not check his phone anxiously. He does not rehearse conversations that may never occur. He simply continues building his life, and if circumstances shift in his favor, he receives that shift with gratitude rather than desperation. This state cannot be faked convincingly, which is precisely why it is so rare and so noticed when genuine. People are remarkably skilled at detecting performed calm versus real calm, even if they cannot articulate the difference consciously. A man practicing real indifference to outcome radiates a kind of settledness that draws people toward him, not because he is trying to attract them, but because settledness itself is magnetic in a world defined by anxious pursuit. The irony, which the Stoics understood centuries ago, is that releasing the need for a specific outcome is often what makes a favorable outcome more likely, not through any trick, but through the simple fact that peace is rare, and rare things draw attention. It helps to understand why this indifference works on a purely practical level, beyond the philosophy itself. Anxious pursuit narrows a person's world, making every interaction feel weighted with stakes that were never actually there in the first place. This weight is exhausting to be around, and most people instinctively withdraw from it, even when they cannot name exactly why. Genuine indifference removes that weight entirely. Conversations become lighter, interactions become easier, and the entire dynamic shifts from something transactional into something that simply feels good to be near. This is not manipulation, because nothing about it is designed to produce a specific reaction. It is simply what naturally happens when a man stops carrying an agenda into every room he enters. Habit 3. He rebuilt his identity around something larger. Rejection often reveals how much of a man's identity had quietly become dependent on a single relationship or a single person's approval. When that source of validation disappears, the resulting emptiness can feel disorienting, almost like losing a limb he did not know he was leaning on. The Stoic response to this discovery is not to rush toward a replacement source of validation, but to examine why the identity had become so narrowly dependent in the first place. Seneca advised his students to build their sense of self on virtue and reason, qualities that cannot be taken away by circumstance, rejection, or another person's decision. A man who rebuilds his identity around discipline, purpose, and character rather than around being chosen by someone specific becomes far less fragile. His sense of worth no longer rises and falls based on someone else's feelings toward him, which paradoxically makes him more emotionally stable in every relationship he enters afterward, including any future one with the person who once rejected him. This process of rebuilding is rarely comfortable. It often requires confronting uncomfortable questions. What did I actually love about this relationship, the person, or the way she made me feel about myself? Was my ambition genuinely mine, or was it partially performed for her approval? These questions are not pleasant, but avoiding them simply delays a reckoning that will eventually happen regardless. A man willing to sit with this discomfort now emerges with an identity built on something sturdier than anyone else's opinion of him, an identity that no future rejection, from anyone, can fully dismantle again. There is a practical exercise worth mentioning here, one that many Stoic practitioners still use today. At the end of each day, a man can honestly ask himself what he did that reflected his own chosen values, independent of anyone's audience or approval. Did he act with discipline when no one was watching? Did he treat others with integrity when there was nothing to gain from it? This daily accounting, practiced consistently over months, gradually shifts the foundation of self-worth away from external validation and onto something a man actually controls, his own conduct. Once this foundation is firmly in place, external events, including rejection, lose much of their power to destabilize him, because his sense of self was never truly built on those external events to begin with. Habit 4. He let go of the narrative of injustice. One of the most seductive traps after rejection is the narrative of injustice. The story that she made a mistake, that she will realize it eventually, that time will prove him right and her wrong. This narrative feels comforting in the short term because it protects the ego from the more painful possibility that the rejection was simply a valid decision deserving of respect. But narratives built on injustice keep a man tethered to the past, waiting for a vindication that may never arrive and that he cannot control regardless. The Stoics practiced a discipline of accepting reality exactly as it is, without the additional suffering created by resisting what has already happened. Epictetus described this as separating events from our judgments about events. The rejection itself is simply a fact, but the suffering comes from the story layered on top of it. A man who releases the injustice narrative stops waiting for the universe to correct a wrong that, in his own honest assessment, may not have been a wrong at all, simply a decision someone else was entitled to make. This release is not about denying pain. Rejection hurts, and pretending otherwise is its own form of dishonesty. It is about processing that pain without constructing a story where he is the wronged hero awaiting eventual justice. A man who has done this work carries himself differently, lighter, less bitter, less prone to subtle resentment leaking into his interactions with others. This lightness, more than any calculated behavior, is often what people sense and respond to when they encounter him again, long after the original rejection has faded into simple history. It is worth acknowledging how deeply the injustice narrative can embed itself, particularly when reinforced by well-meaning friends who validate every grievance without challenge. Sympathy, offered too readily, can accidentally deepen a man's attachment to the story of being wronged rather than helping him move past it. This is why Stoic practice often emphasizes solitude and honest self-examination over constant external validation. Not because sympathy is unwelcome, but because healing ultimately requires an internal reckoning that no amount of outside agreement can substitute for. A man who does this work independently, rather than outsourcing his healing entirely to sympathetic friends, tends to emerge with a more durable, honest peace than one who simply had his grievance echoed back to him repeatedly. If this is resonating with you, take a moment to subscribe to Quotes Library. This channel is built for men who want real philosophy, not shortcuts, and there is much more waiting for you here. Habit 5. He practiced radical honesty about his own role. Few things stall a man's growth after rejection more effectively than a refusal to examine his own contribution to what went wrong. It is far easier to catalog someone else's flaws than to sit honestly with the ways his own behavior, patterns, or blind spots may have played a genuine role in the relationship's ending. The Stoics placed enormous value on self-examination, not as an exercise in self-punishment, but as the only reliable path toward actual change rather than repeated cycles of the same mistakes. Marcus Aurelius kept a private journal specifically for this purpose, reviewing his own conduct nightly with unflinching honesty, noting where he had fallen short of his own standards. This was not self-flagellation. It was disciplined accountability, practiced privately, without an audience to perform for. A man willing to apply this same discipline after rejection might ask himself difficult questions. Did I listen as well as I believed I did? Did I show up consistently, or only when it was convenient? Did I confuse control for care at times, or dismiss concerns that deserved real attention? These questions are uncomfortable precisely because they require abandoning the more flattering narrative where the rejection was simply someone else's error in judgment. This honesty is not about assuming full blame for a decision that was never entirely his to control. Two people shape any relationship, and rejection is rarely the result of one person's actions alone. But refusing to examine his own role guarantees that whatever patterns contributed to the ending will simply repeat themselves in the next relationship, and the one after that, regardless of who the other person happens to be. A man who does this work honestly, without excessive self-blame but without convenient denial either, emerges genuinely changed. Not performing growth for an audience, but actually equipped to build something healthier next time, whether that next time involves the same person or someone entirely different. Habit 6. He learned to sit with solitude without fear. Many men escalate their pursuit after rejection specifically because solitude feels unbearable. The silence left behind by someone's absence can feel like evidence that something is deeply wrong, prompting a frantic search for anything that fills the void. A new distraction, a rebound, an argument for why the rejection should be reversed. The Stoics viewed solitude very differently, not as an emergency to escape, but as an opportunity for the kind of honest self-examination that constant company makes difficult. Seneca wrote to a friend that no person can truly possess themselves until they have learned to be alone without anxiety. This was not a romantic ideal but a practical observation. A man who cannot tolerate his own company will always be vulnerable to whoever offers to fill the silence, regardless of whether that person is actually good for him. Learning to sit with solitude, uncomfortable as it initially feels, builds a kind of self-sufficiency that changes how a man approaches every future relationship, including the possibility of reconciliation with someone who once walked away. This does not mean isolating entirely or rejecting connection. It means developing the capacity to be genuinely fine on his own, so that any future relationship is chosen from strength rather than desperation. A man who has mastered solitude does not need anyone to complete him, which is precisely what makes him whole enough to be genuinely good for someone else. This wholeness is rarely built quickly. It is built through the deliberate, sometimes painful practice of staying present with silence instead of fleeing from it at the first opportunity. Practically, this practice can begin small. An evening spent without a phone, sitting with whatever thoughts and feelings surface, without immediately reaching for distraction. A weekend spent alone, deliberately, rather than filled reflexively with plans designed to avoid empty time. These exercises feel uncomfortable at first, sometimes intensely so, because many men have simply never practiced sustained solitude before, having moved from one source of external stimulation to the next since adolescence. But discomfort here is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of unfamiliar muscles being used for the first time. Like any discipline, it becomes easier with repetition, until solitude transforms from something to be feared into something closer to a trusted companion, always available regardless of who else is or is not present in his life at any given moment. Habit 7. He replaced bitterness with genuine well-wishing. There is a particular kind of freedom available to a man who can genuinely wish someone well after rejection, without any hidden agenda buried inside that well-wishing. This is different from performative maturity, the kind that says gracious words publicly while privately hoping the other person suffers regret. Genuine well-wishing requires actually releasing the desire for the other person's misfortune or eventual realization of a mistake. The Stoics practiced a discipline sometimes called cosmic perspective, viewing individual disappointments within the much larger context of a life, a world, and countless other people also navigating their own difficult decisions. From this wider view, a woman's decision to walk away becomes simply one choice among the millions of choices she is entitled to make in her own life, not a personal offense requiring resentment in return. This perspective does not eliminate disappointment, but it does dissolve the bitterness that so easily calcifies around unprocessed rejection. A man who has done this internal work carries none of the residual resentment that often leaks out in subtle ways. Sarcasm about women in general, guarded cynicism in new relationships, and inability to fully trust again. His well-wishing is not a performance for anyone watching. It is simply the natural result of having processed the pain fully enough that bitterness no longer has anywhere to attach itself. This kind of freedom, rare as it is immediately noticeable to anyone who encounters him, and it is often precisely what makes reconnection feel safe again, if that possibility ever arises naturally. This habit also protects a man from a subtler danger, the tendency to carry unprocessed bitterness from one relationship into the next, poisoning connections that had nothing to do with the original rejection. A man who has not genuinely released resentment often finds himself testing new partners against old wounds, reacting with disproportionate suspicion to behaviors that merely resemble something painful from the past. Genuine well-wishing toward someone who once rejected him is, in this sense, not really about her at all. It is a form of self-protection, ensuring that the next relationship he builds is not quietly sabotaged by grievances that belong to a different chapter entirely. Habit 8. He focused entirely on what he could build. Grief and rejection both create a vacuum, and vacuums demand to be filled with something. Men who spiral after rejection typically fill that vacuum with rumination, replaying conversations, analyzing what went wrong, constructing alternate timelines where things ended differently. Men who transform after rejection fill that same vacuum with construction, building skills, businesses, friendships, physical strength, and disciplines that have nothing to do with winning anyone back. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire while grieving personal losses that would have paralyzed most people, not by suppressing grief but by channeling his energy into the responsibilities directly in front of him. This is the essence of Stoic resilience, not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain become the organizing principle of one's days. A man who redirects his energy toward genuine construction finds that the pain does not disappear, but it stops occupying the center of his attention, gradually becoming background rather than foreground. This redirection is not a suppression tactic disguised as productivity. It works because building something real requires presence, and presence is the opposite of rumination. A man deeply engaged in mastering a skill, building a business, or deepening a friendship simply has less bandwidth available for replaying the past. Over months, this shift compounds. He looks up one day and realizes the rejection that once consumed his thoughts has quietly become a minor chapter in a much larger story he is actively writing, rather than the entire book he once feared it would become. There is a particular satisfaction in looking back after a year of genuine construction and recognizing tangible proof of growth. A skill mastered, a business grown, a body strengthened, friendships deepened. This proof matters, not because it is meant to be displayed or announced, but because it gives a man concrete evidence that his energy, redirected, produced something real. This evidence becomes its own quiet confidence, entirely separate from whether the original rejection was ever reversed. Many men report that by the time genuine construction has taken hold, the original outcome they once obsessed over no longer carries the weight it once did, having been gradually replaced by pride in who they became during the process of moving forward. Habit 9. He redefined what strength actually meant. Many men enter adulthood with an inherited, largely unexamined definition of strength. One built on Stoicism in the popular, misunderstood sense of the word, meaning emotional suppression rather than emotional discipline. Under this definition, rejection is something to be hidden, joked about, or buried beneath bravado. The actual philosophy of Stoicism teaches something quite different. Strength is not the absence of feeling, but the disciplined management of feeling in service of reason and virtue. A man who redefines strength along these lines stops treating his pain after rejection as something shameful to conceal. He allows himself to genuinely grieve the loss, to feel the disappointment fully, without collapsing into it or performing toughness he does not actually feel. This is a harder path than either extreme, harder than pure suppression, which merely postpones the reckoning, and harder than unrestrained emotional collapse, which offers no structure for moving through the pain productively. The middle path, disciplined feeling rather than suppressed or unrestrained feeling, requires more maturity than either alternative. Epictetus taught that emotional reactions are natural and not inherently problematic. What matters is whether reason governs how a person acts on those reactions. A man can feel devastated by rejection and still choose, deliberately, not to send the desperate message, not to spiral into self-destructive behavior, not to let the devastation dictate his actions for the following weeks or months. This is the actual meaning of Stoic strength, and it looks nothing like the popular caricature of a man who feels nothing. It looks like a man who feels everything honestly, while still choosing his actions with discipline rather than letting raw emotion drive the wheel entirely. This redefinition changes far more than how a man handles rejection. It changes how he handles every difficulty life presents afterward: professional setbacks, family conflict, unexpected loss. Once a man has learned to hold pain honestly while still acting with discipline, this becomes a transferable skill, applicable to nearly every hardship he will ever face. In this sense, rejection, as painful as it is in the moment, often becomes one of the more valuable teachers a man encounters, precisely because it forces this redefinition of strength in a way that comfort rarely does. Habit 10. He stopped measuring time by her absence. There is a quiet trap many men fall into after rejection without realizing it: measuring the passage of time entirely in relation to the person who left. 3 weeks since she said goodbye. 2 months since the last conversation. Half a year since he last saw her name appear on his phone. This way of counting time keeps her, invisibly, at the center of his days, even when he believes he has moved on in every other respect. The Stoics practiced a discipline of living fully within the present day, treating each morning as a fresh beginning rather than simply another entry in a countdown clock tied to the past. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that the only time truly available to any person is the present moment, not the past, which cannot be changed, and not an imagined future reunion, which cannot be guaranteed. A man who internalizes this stops counting days since her departure and starts simply living each day for what it actually contains, independent of any anniversary tied to the relationship's ending. This shift sounds subtle, but its effects are significant. A man who has stopped measuring time by her absence no longer flinches when a date on the calendar happens to align with something from the relationship. He no longer catches himself calculating how long it has been, because the calculation no longer feels relevant to how he is actually living. His days become genuinely his own again, structured around his own goals and rhythms rather than orbiting, even unconsciously, around an absence he has not yet fully released. Reaching this point is rarely a single decision. It happens gradually, often without the man noticing precisely when it occurred, until one day he realizes weeks have passed without a single thought of counting anything related to her at all. This, more than any external sign, is often the clearest internal evidence that the transformation described throughout this video has genuinely taken hold. Not because he willed himself to stop caring, but because his life became full enough, on its own terms, that counting simply stopped mattering. A short story, the return of Tunda. Tunda had been rejected by Ngozi after 8 months of what he believed was a strong relationship. For weeks afterward, he sent long messages explaining his intentions, showing up outside her workplace with flowers, and asking mutual friends to speak on his behalf. None of it changed her decision, and eventually, exhausted and humiliated, he stopped entirely, not as a strategy, but because he simply had nothing left to give toward a door that would not open. In the months that followed, Tunda threw himself into rebuilding a business he had neglected during the relationship. He returned to a discipline of early mornings and quiet reading he had abandoned. He reconnected with old friends he had drifted from without noticing. He did not do this to prove anything to Ngozi. He genuinely stopped thinking about her most days, absorbed instead in the life he was rebuilding for himself. Nearly a year later, Tunda ran into Ngozi at a mutual friends gathering. He was calm, genuinely engaged in conversation with others, entirely present rather than searching the room for her reaction. Later that evening, she approached him herself, remarking on how different he seemed, steadier, less anxious, more grounded than the man she remembered. They spoke for an hour, easily, without any hidden agenda on his side. Weeks later, she reached out again, this time asking if he would be open to reconnecting properly. Tunda considered it honestly, without desperation, and eventually said yes, not because he had won anything, but because the man he had become was someone who could enter that reconnection from genuine strength rather than old need. Whether it worked out or not was never the measure of his success. Becoming that man was. Tunda later reflected that the version of himself who had stood outside her workplace with flowers would not have recognized the man who sat across from her a year later. That earlier version had been trying to prove something, to earn back a decision that was never his to make. The later version was simply living his life, and their reconnection happened as a natural byproduct of that life rather than as its central objective. He often told friends afterward that the hardest lesson had not been learning to let go of Ngozi specifically, but learning to stop needing anyone's return to feel complete in the first place. Once that need dissolved, everything else, including, eventually, her genuine return, arrived not as a prize he had won, but as something that simply happened to align with the life he had already chosen to build for himself, independent of her. Closing thoughts. The real reason people sometimes return after rejection is rarely a clever tactic or a perfectly timed message. It is the simple, undeniable magnetism of a person who has genuinely rebuilt themselves, not for anyone's benefit, but for their own integrity. This transformation cannot be faked, rushed, or performed convincingly for long, because it requires actual internal work that shows up in 100 small, unconscious ways. The tone of a man's voice, the steadiness of his presence, the absence of desperation in his eyes. But it is essential to end where we began. This process is not a guaranteed formula for getting someone back, and treating it as one misses the entire philosophy behind it. Some people who walk away never return, and a man who has done this work genuinely will be at peace with that outcome too, because his worth was never actually dependent on her decision in the first place. The goal was never manipulation disguised as growth. The goal was becoming a man of substance, discipline, and peace, a man whose value exists independently of anyone's choice to stay or leave. If you take only one idea from everything covered here, let it be this. The men who transform most powerfully after rejection are never focused on the person who left. They are focused entirely on the life they are building, with or without her. And that singular focus is what produces every other change described in this video. The calm, the settledness, the quiet magnetism that draws people toward him without any deliberate effort on his side. This is not a strategy to memorize and deploy. It is a way of living that, practiced honestly over time, changes a man from the inside in ways no tactic ever could. 10 habits, one underlying principle. A man's worth was never assigned to him by another person's decision, and it cannot be taken from him by another person's departure either. This is the oldest lesson Stoicism offers, applied to one of the most universal pains a man will ever face. Whether reconnection happens or not is genuinely beside the point, and any man who has truly absorbed this philosophy will find that he no longer needs the reunion to feel that the work was worthwhile. The work itself, becoming steadier, calmer, more disciplined, more whole, is its own complete reward, regardless of what anyone else ultimately chooses to do with the man he has become. If this video gave you something valuable today, subscribe to Quotes Library for more Stoic wisdom built for real life, not shortcuts. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and let this be one more step forward. Keep becoming.